When we think of the Italian Renaissance, we generally think of the tremendous explosion of artistic styles and artistic generation that occurred in that time period. But it's also a time period in which technology developed to a considerable extent. In fact, even though the Industrial Revolution is still 300 years in the future from this time period, many of the roots of that industrialism were set down during the Renaissance. The relation of art to technology is actually a close one. Perhaps the best example is in architecture. Renaissance architecture shows several of the same characteristics that I've already pointed to in terms of Renaissance science and technology. Most notably, a return to the tastes and canons of the classical architecture of antiquity, of the Greeks and the Romans, and the use of mathematics. Just compare a, let's say, Florentine Renaissance palazzo with a Gothic cathedral. Both of them are wonderful pieces of architecture, but one is clearly much more related, or thinks it's much more related to the Roman and Greek models of mathematical proportion than the other, that of course being the Florentine palazzo. Both use mathematics, but the kind of ratios, the kind of ideas, the kind of aesthetic for the Renaissance building is consciously modeled on that of the classical period. In architecture, we can point to the Roman author Vitruvius. Vitruvius's books on architecture are the sole surviving treatise on architecture from antiquity. It was edited and published widely in the Renaissance, and it also deals with technological issues such as hydraulics, machinery, clockworks of various kinds. Clearly, if you think about it, Renaissance builders also needed a certain type of technology in order to actualize the plans that were built by Renaissance architects, or the plans that were drawn by Renaissance architects, I should say. So there's a technological dimension there as well. One of the thinkers, the first thinker I'd like to point to that exemplifies the interconnections between the three areas of art, science, and technology is the famous Leonardo da Vinci. Da Vinci was born in 1452, so he's 21 years older than Copernicus. They lived at approximately the same time, but Da Vinci being the elder, of course. Da Vinci dies in 1519, so well before Copernicus. He's renowned for his work in all three of these areas, in art, technology, and science. The interesting point is how he combined them. Let's take as an example his attempt, although it was never actually carried out, let's say his plan of making a gigantic equestrian statue of Francesco Forza, the Duke of Milan. He had to deal with three issues, one in each of the fields. First of all, the design of the horse, which is clearly part of fine arts and sculpture and design. But to do so, what did he look at? He looked at the anatomy of horses to study that from a scientific perspective, a proportional kind of perspective. And we know from Leonardo's other artistic works that he looked at anatomy of the human figure, for example, in order to paint and draw the human figure. He also had to deal with the idea of melting, transporting, and pouring a vast amount, many tons, of molten metal. So he had to deal with the technological aspects of furnace building and how you manipulate that much molten metal at one time. Similarly, when he worked on a project to improve the waterworks in Milan, he had to deal not only with the practical aspects of canals and sewer building and how to move the water, but he also looked at principles of hydraulics at the same time, about how water behaves. Well, the fertile inventiveness of Leonardo is well known in his surviving notebooks, some of which were rediscovered rather recently in the 20th century. You know about his drawings of various mechanical contrivances, weaponry, and his famous designs for flying machines, parachutes, these sort of things. Even though these were never built, it's a sense of his ideals of applying technology to inventing machinery of various kinds. Another point in which he can be seen as typical of the Renaissance is the way he sees analogies and mathematical proportions everywhere in art and in nature. One of his best known drawings, the drawing of the human figure placed within a circle, is all about mathematical ratios and mathematical harmonies in the human body. So this interest in mathematics as a key to nature is important to Leonardo as well. This mathematical worldview that we've talked about before in the Renaissance, which is partly inspired by Plato and Archimedes, so the two most important mathematical thinkers, along with Pythagoras of the ancient world, was also involved in an important development of Renaissance art, namely perspective, mathematical perspective, highly mathematized ideas of foreshortening and vanishing points that shows up strongly in Italian Renaissance art. Well, let's now move from art to something that's a little bit grungier, and that is mining and metallurgy. Mining and metallurgy experienced a dramatic growth from 1470 to about 1550, and for a lot of very good reasons. The increasing trade, increasing mercantile nature of European society created an increased need for coinage. So you need to dig up gold and silver and copper to make your coins. Also, Europe is increasingly unstable, and so you need metal for weapons. Now for cannons, since cannons are being used more. And you also need raw materials for manufacturing. You need salts and vitriol for textile dyeing, salts for various other kinds of manufacturing. Well, one of the most important writers on mining from this period goes under the name of Georgius Agricola. He was born in 1494, lived to 1555. His best-known work was published posthumously, and it's entitled De Re Metallica, which we can translate that Latin title as On Metallic Stuff. It was published in 1556. It contains descriptions of how to find, how to open, and how to work mines, how to refine metals, how to smelt ores, various sorts of mechanical contrivances that you need to operate a mining venture. The work is famous for its illustrations. Almost every other page is a large woodcut showing these aspects of mining or technology. Now, Georg Agricola was actually born Georg Bauer. Early in his life, he worked on translations from Galen and Hippocrates, and his first mining treatise was written as a dialogue that compared local German and ancient knowledge. And an important part of De Re Metallica is creating a Latin vocabulary for mining. Now, you put all these things together. His German name Bauer, which means farmer, he styles himself instead in Latin. Farmer in Latin is Agricola. So you can see what kind of tradition he's coming from. He turns his name into Latin, he translates Greek, he deals with Galen and Hippocrates, he writes a dialogue. He's a humanist. In fact, part of his purpose in writing this book was to extend humanist scholarship and philology to a technical craft, to sort of elevate this technical craft by creating a learned language for it. Now, one of the interesting things is that while Agricola undoubtedly visited mines and their operations, he was actually a physician, and he also was a teacher of Greek. How familiar he was with these operations is a little bit open to debate. If we look closely at his descriptions of processes and at his illustrations, some of them are not actually going to work. But that's not what De Re Metallica is about. If you think about it, it's a big book with lots of illustrations. Cost a lot of money. You're not going to have it sitting next to your furnace to tell you how to do smelting operations. You're not going to carry it down in the mine and say, oh, well, we have to dig a shaft here, Agricola says so. It's an expensive work. It sat in libraries and it was read by other humanists. How many mining engineers actually read it is open to a lot of question. Therefore, we can compare it now to another work that appeared at about the same time, La Pirotecnia, an Italian work published in 1540 by Vannuccio Biringuccio. Biringuccio seems to have a lot more first-hand knowledge of workshop practices than does Agricola. He's more of a real technician than a humanist. And this makes sense because first he was director of building at the Duomo in Florence. He then moved to Rome. He was invited there to head the munitions of the city of Rome, and also the foundry of Rome. His text describes everything from smelting and refining to mass production castings, bell founding, fireworks, all kinds of things, explosives. It's also illustrated, not as profusely, and perhaps a little bit more comprehensively if you're trying to do these processes. So he's moving a little bit more towards the role of a technician, someone who knows what's actually going on, a little bit more than Agricola. Further on in that tradition, further on in that move towards more practical books, are a set of books called the Bergbüchlein, that is, the little mining treatises. And these were really much more the kind of thing that someone dealing with the mining industry would have used. You can see this in their format. They tend to be smaller, and they're not great tomes that would be at home in a large library. The sort of thing you could stick in your pocket or hold while you're doing, say, a refining operation in the fire. They're much cheaper. They were published much more widely. There are fewer illustrations in them. And rather than using learned Latin as in De Re Metallica, they're generally written in the German vernacular. So they were more geared to actual practitioners. Now, one thing that happens at this time is that the huge increase in mining makes energy sources much, much more critical than they had been previously. The larger and the deeper mines that have to be dug as the European mines run out, and they start running out in the 16th and 17th centuries, they have to keep building deeper and deeper mines. So this requires more and more mechanization. One, you have to have some kind of ventilator, some kind of mechanical ventilators to get fresh air down into the mines, or your miners suffocate. You have to have pumps to pump the water out of the mines. As you get deeper, you go further and further below the water table. The bottom shafts of the mine keep filling up with water, so you need pumps to keep pumping out the water. So what was used in general were water wheels as the major power source, either to turn ventilators, to turn bucket chains that would pull water up, to use piston pumps to pull water out of mines, to operate rock crushers. There are a lot of these illustrated in Agricola's work, to crush the ore, to operate mechanical bellows and this sort of thing. Gunpowder is used for the first time for blasting in mines, not to mention its usage in warfare, which I'll get to in a moment. But now, remember, there's something else you need in mining and smelting. You need high temperatures. You need a lot of fire. Well, it turns out that wood and charcoal starts getting scarce. The areas around these mines were totally deforested to feed the furnaces. In fact, if you look at a lot of Agricola's illustrations, you can see in the foreground and the background stumps of trees or broken trees that may partially be an artistic convention, but it may also give us a sense of the scarred landscape that must have surrounded these mining operations in the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries. So human technology is starting to have a serious ecological impact at this point. Around 1500, owing to the shortages of wood and charcoal, mineral coal, that is coal that's taken out of the ground, starts to be used to stoke the fires for the first time. Part of the problem is you can't use coal for everything. It generally has a lot of sulfur in it. European coal generally is not of the best quality. It just doesn't exist in good quality there. The sulfur that's given off if you're trying to smelt certain metals actually starts to corrode the metal, so you can't use coal that much. But nonetheless, it's actually starting to be used in quantity around 1500 through the 16th century. Well, now, let's look at one other feature of importance, that is military engineering. Again, it's related to scientific topics. Starting in the 14th century, cannon and firearms begin to be used much more. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was carried out, was helped by the Turks' use of artillery. And artillery, it gets used more and more in Europe. So you need gunpowder for this, you need bronze casting techniques, you need boring techniques for cannons. What happens is that but within 100 years, all the medieval fortresses are now obsolete. You've got these big, high walls, perfect targets for your gunners. and new kinds of fortifications have to be developed that are low, that won't give a target to your gunners. Well, if your gunners have a target, they need to know how to get the ball in a particular place to knock down a wall. If you're attacking someone with a sword, it's fairly easy to see where to stab. But if you're shooting a cannon, that ball has to travel hundreds of yards through the air and land where you want it to. Therefore, they need to know something about projectile motion. One of the most important people in this regard is Niccolo of Brescia, nicknamed Tartaglia, born 1500. He studied the motion of projectiles, found, for example, that inclining your cannon at a 45-degree angle gave you the greatest range. He didn't try to explain why. He didn't explain why, that is. But he did make at least that discovery. The why for that had to wait for Galileo in the early 17th century, who showed more about projectile motion. At this time in the 16th century, the people studying projectile motion in Italy, in Spain, in England, knew that the projectile moved in some kind of a curve, but what kind of a curve that was exactly, they did not know. They looked at it generally using the science of the time, the kinematics of the time, that is Aristotelian, with its combination of violent and natural motion. Violent motion against, away from the earth, and natural motion back towards it. What ended up happening is because they couldn't figure out the projectile motion exactly right, they couldn't figure out some predictive method, they instead made tables. Put your gun so high with so much of a charge of gunpowder if you wanted to go to a certain place. Well, fine. I'd like to finish off this lecture with a spectacular engineering project. Let me tell you the story of this monumental project. It didn't have a monetary value like mining engineering. It didn't have a military payoff like looking at projectile motions from cannons, but it did have an enormous symbolic value. It was, I think, presumably the 16th century's great project, the thing that everyone was talking about, that everyone was wowed by. And that's what technology does for us to a considerable extent. This is why it has this close relation to magic as well. Technology is always surprising us. It's always wonder-making. Well, what is this project? The project was to move the last standing obelisk in Rome to a new position, to take it down, move it, and put it back up again. Let me tell you the background to this obelisk. The history of this obelisk starts in the 13th century BC, way back with the ancient Egyptians. That's when it was presumably quarried and set up in Egypt. It stood there in Egypt for over 1,000 years until Egypt became a Roman colony. The Romans took a liking to this monumental Egyptian architecture and carried a large number of obelisks back to Rome. This one in particular, was moved to Rome in the 1st century. It was moved under the Emperor Caligula, who in 41 AD erected it at the base of one of the 7 hills of Rome, in this case at the base of the Vatican Hill. It was presumably part of the circus. A circus there, these obelisks often formed the ends of the hairpin turns. If you've seen Ben-Hur movies or similar Roman epics, you know that the Romans ran their chariot races around very sharp turns at the end, and often they would put an obelisk or some statue at the end of these turns. That's presumably what this was used for in 41 AD. Well, a couple of decades later, a certain fisherman by the name of Peter was buried within sight of that obelisk. And within due course, when Christianity was made legal, when it was made the official religion of the Roman Empire by the Emperor Constantine, a huge basilica was raised over the site of the final resting place of Peter's bones, there on the Vatican Hill. St. Peter's Basilica, built there in the early 4th century, near the obelisk that had been set up there in 41 AD. Now let's fast forward through over 1,000 years. It's now towards the end, it's the late 16th century. That old obelisk has been not half buried, it's been buried up to the level of its pedestal. 25 feet of debris has filled in around it. So the old Roman pedestal is almost no longer visible. Old St. Peter's is literally collapsing in on itself. There's a famous event that happens in the previous years where a wall collapses on worshippers and kills a large number of them. So St. Peter's needs to be torn down and rebuilt. In its place rises the great Renaissance and Baroque St. Peter's that we know today. Well, midway through the construction, an idea occurs. What are we going to do with this obelisk? Stuck alongside, right next to the basilica starts encroaching on it because it's a larger basilica. How about moving it? Moving it? No one has moved an obelisk since the Romans. The Romans left no records of how they did it, much less the Egyptians. How do you move an obelisk? Let me give you an idea of the engineering problem here. The obelisk is a single piece of stone weighing 360 tons. It's 83 feet high, the height of a 6-story building, 83 feet high. The base, square base, is 9 feet wide on each side. It's an immense piece of stone. So it's heavy, it's big, and it's also, as a single piece of stone, quite fragile. How can we move it? Well, in 1585, Pope Sixtus V, he's the successor of Pope Gregory XIII, who reformed the calendar. Sixtus V does what happens in any big engineering projects. He puts it out for competitive bids. The bids come in, the plans come in, they're reviewed by a committee of cardinals and engineers, and in early 1586, they settle on a plan submitted by one Domenico Fontana. Domenico Fontana was born in 1543, so the same year that De Revolutionibus is published by Copernicus, and he lives to 1607. He wins the contract, and he's given enormous powers to take whatever he needs, do whatever he needs to secure the moving of this obelisk. How in the world does he do this? Well, the first thing he does is he builds a huge wooden tower around the obelisk. He inspects it using the tower. He goes up there on the tower to take the brass ball off the top of the obelisk, which, rumor had it, contained the ashes of Julius Caesar. In fact, they open the ball and they find there's nothing in it. So Julius Caesar was not there, but that's one of the things he does. He builds this tower, and then he encases the obelisk in iron bars that run vertically up its sides and bands of iron around it to hold the obelisk together, to give it a rigidity. Remember, it's stone, a single piece of stone, 83 feet long. You start to move it, it's just going to break very easily because of its brittleness. So he encases it in an iron cradle. He then attaches blocks and tackle to this iron cage, runs them through the tower, ties ropes down to windlasses. He uses 40 windlasses that will be operated by both horse and manpower to pull on the ropes. He's going to try to pull the obelisk straight up off its pedestal, 360 tons. There's one problem, though. In order to get the maximum amount of upward force, he's going to use 5 levers. These levers are 50 feet long. Well, one of the levers, 50 feet long levers, is going to run into the sacristy of St. Peter's. It's going to run into the wall. So what's he do? He gets permission from the Pope and he tears down the wall. Not only does he tear down the wall so that the lever can pass through, he puts 3 of the capstans into the floor of the sacristy of St. Peter's. And several ropes run through a hole in one side of the sacristy, out the other side, to capstans on the other side. So he really gets a free hand on what he's going to do here to move the obelisk safely. Begins to tell us something about Renaissance mentality, of how important this ancient monument actually was, and how important it was successfully to imitate something that the Romans had done that hadn't been done in 1500 years. Right. So, He gets everything set up, and April the 30th, 1586, is set as the date to lift the obelisk. First time it had been moved from that position since 41 AD, when it was put there. The day before is devoted entirely to prayer and penance. At dawn, all of the workers working on this project confess and receive the sacrament. Early in the morning, crowds gather everywhere. The College of Cardinals, all the people of Rome, held behind a fence at watching this great project. The Pope, however, has issued an order. Fearing that the noise of this immense crowd would distract the workers, he passes a decree enjoining absolute silence upon the crowd. No one may speak under penalty. Penalties, as the decree says, including death. This is how important this move was. In the mid-morning, they begin the operation. Fontana has put together a series of signals to signal the workers when to pull and when to stop. A trumpet blast would signal pull. A bell ringing would mean stop. In the morning, the first trumpet blast rings out, and 75 horses and 900 men start turning 40 capstans, start pulling on 5 levers. The ropes they're pulling on, if you calculate it, it's 8 miles of rope that they're starting to pull on now. As Fontana describes it, suddenly there's a huge rumbling like an earthquake, and the obelisk, which had been tilting slightly, suddenly rights itself and becomes vertical. He rings the bell. They inspect the tower. They inspect all the ropes to make sure everything is all right. The trumpet blast rings out again, and they heave to the 40 capstans and the 8 miles of rope, and the obelisk swings up off of its pedestal into midair. By 10 o'clock at night, after many repetitions of this, the obelisk is hanging in the middle of the tower, and they stop for the night. The next day, they begin again. The obelisk is lowered slowly onto a moving carriage. They put the carriage underneath it. The carriage is on rollers, and the obelisk is moved. As it moves, it pushes the carriage out beneath it. By the way, the end of this carriage goes into the sacristy through the pierced wall of St. Peter's, and the obelisk lays down on its side on the carriage. It sits there for a while Fontana disassembles the pedestal, the old Roman pedestal, which he's had to dig out from its 25 feet of accumulated debris. The pedestal is moved to its new position. What's the new position? Where's all this going? Why, to the center of St. Peter's Square. It's going to be the focal point of the square in front of the mother church of Christendom. An interesting image, isn't it? 13th century BC, pagan, Egyptian obelisk moved by the pagan Romans is now going to become the focal point of the square in front of St. Peter's Basilica. The pedestal is moved. By the way, the pedestal weighs about 110 tons itself. It's moved to a new location, and then the obelisk is brought to it. In order to do so, Fontana builds a great earthen causeway, many feet wide, down which the obelisk will be run on rollers. People heave to, and the obelisk is dragged down to its new position. The wooden tower, disassembled, reassembled over the relocated pedestal, put back up. He makes a very clever design for the tower so that it can be taken down and put back up. And now the number of people is increased. He uses more horses and more men, and the obelisk is slowly raised from its carriage. The carriage is pulled out from underneath it. It becomes vertical again and is lowered onto the pedestal on the 10th of September in 1586. And it's been there ever since. On the 28th of September, it's consecrated, and eventually, in the following century, Bernini will build his great colonnade of pillars around St. Peter's Square, around this focal point of this obelisk. Now, think for a moment what this move means. Think for a moment what the end of the 16th century was like in Rome. Gregory the 13th replaces Julius Caesar's calendar. His successor, Sixtus V, sees that a Roman accomplishment which has been unthought of for years now happens. The ball which supposedly contains Julius Caesar's ashes is removed and replaced with a cross, and the obelisk is put up in St. Peter's. Here now is a new Rome, a true Renaissance, where the late 16th century has outdone the Romans. Fontana, by the way, is thrilled to find that the Romans, in putting up the obelisk, actually broke a few feet off of it, but he gets to move it without damaging it. Before Fontana is done, he discovers several other obelisks in Rome and erects them as well. Well, now we must move from earthly works to heavenly works. In our next lecture, we're going to look at three astronomers. One, the last of the naked eye observers. Another, the first of the telescopic observers. And the man who corresponded with both of them, who looked for the hidden harmonies that God had implanted in the universe.